It was a quiet evening in the quiet lane of Maplewood Lane. The sun had just vanished below the horizon, gilding the row of quaint houses lining the street with golden rays. In one such house lived Mrs. Harriet, an elderly woman with her hobby of gardening and a soft spot for feeding the birds in the neighborhood. Popular among the neighbors, she imparted a certain warmth to the entire street. Next door to Mrs. Harriet lived Mr. Thompson, a retired policeman who shared his home with a most unusual dog named Rusty. Rusty was a German shepherd who, in another lifetime, had served gallantly in the force alongside Mr. Thompson himself. Now older and crippled from his injuries sustained in the line of duty, Rusty sat out in the yard, taking great pleasure in the restfulness and quietness of Maplewood Lane. He moved slowly, his back leg stiff, and most people who saw him assumed he was no longer capable of much. But there was more to Rusty than met the eye. That evening Mrs. Harriet was preparing her dinner when she heard a strange noise at her front door. She frowned as she turned off the stove, with the sound of scraping and muffled voices growing louder. She made her way to the front hallway and peered through the window. Her heart leaped with a jump as she saw two men in dark clothing, trying to force their way into her house. "Oh dear," Mrs. Harriet muttered, her eyes wide with alarm. She began to back away from the door, her hands trembling. She needed help, but she didn't have a phone on her. Her mind whirled, trying to think of what to do, when suddenly a thought occurred to her. Rusty. Mrs. Harriet hurried to the back door, slipping out quietly into her garden. She could hear the intruders still fumbling with her front door lock, their voices growing more frustrated. She moved as quickly as her old bones would allow, making her way to the low fence that separated her yard from Mr. Thompson's. "Rusty! Here, boy!" She called in a hushed voice, her eyes scanning the neighboring yard. A moment of silence, and then she saw him, Rusty, who had slowly gotten up from his side under the porch, his ears perked at the sound of her voice. "Good boy, Rusty," Mrs. Harriet whispered as Rusty made his way over to the fence. She opened the gate, letting him into her yard. The dog moved with a slight limp, his eyes alert as he looked at Mrs. Harriet, sensing her distress. "There are bad men trying to get into my house," she said, her voice shaking as she pointed toward the front of her house. "Can you help Rusty?" Rusty tilted his head, his ears twitching as he listened. Then, without hesitation, he turned, making his way towards the front of the house. Mrs. Harriet followed at a distance, her heart pounding as she watched the dog move. Despite his limp, there was a determination in Rusty's steps that gave her hope. Meanwhile, at the front door, the two intruders, a lanky man named Pete and his stocky partner, Joey, were getting increasingly frustrated. "I told you we should have brought better tools," Pete muttered, his voice full of irritation as he fiddled with the lockpick. Joey rolled his eyes and looked around warily. "Oh, quit whining. Well, get it. Just give me a minute." Pete opened his mouth to respond, but before he could utter a word, a low growl rumbled from behind them. The two men froze, their heads snapped around to see Rusty standing there, his eyes fixed on them, his teeth bared in a warning. "Whoa, whoa, whoa!" Joey exclaimed, stumbling back with his eyes wide. "Where did that dog come from?" Pete narrowed his eyes, attempting to conceal the sudden unease that welled up. "It's just an old mutt," he said, waving a hand in dismissal. "Look at him, he's limping. What's he gonna do, drool on us?" Rusty let out another growl, this time louder, more menacing. He took a step forward, his eyes never leaving the intruders. There was something in his gaze, a steely determination that made Joey swallow hard. Pete, I don't like this," Joey said, his voice shaking a little. "That dog looks like he means business." Pete snorted, rolling his eyes. "Oh, come on. He's just bluffing. Watch this." He took one step closer to Rusty, raising his voice. "Get lost, you stupid mutt!" But Rusty was far from bluffing. In a flash, the old dog lunged forward, his bark echoing through the quiet street. Pete yelped in surprise, stumbling backward and tripping over his own feet, landing hard on the ground. Joey, eyes wide with panic, turned and bolted down the driveway, not even bothering to look back. Pete scrambled to his feet, pale-faced, as he glanced at Rusty, who was still growling. His stance was protective, barring the path to Mrs. Harriet's front door. Okay. We're going! Pete shouted, his voice cracking as he turned and ran after Joey, his legs nearly giving out from under him in his haste. Rusty watched them go, his growl fading as he stood his ground, ensuring they were well and truly gone before turning back towards Mrs. Harriet. Mrs. Harriet, who had been watching from the corner of the house, exhaled a breath she didn't realize she was holding. Tears welled up in her eyes as she made her way toward Rusty, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Oh, Rusty, you wonderful boy," she whispered, her voice shaking as she knelt down, wrapping her arms around the old dog's neck. Rusty let out a soft huff, his tail wagging gently as he nuzzled her cheek. Just then, Mr. Thompson came hurrying out of his house, his eyes wide with concern. "Harriet! Are you all right?" I heard Rusty barking. He trailed off, his gaze falling on the scene in front of him, Mrs. Harriet, still hugging Rusty, and the open front door of her house. "Mrs. Harriet looked up, her eyes filled with tears. "Oh, Thompson, Rusty saved me. There were two men, they tried to break in, but Rusty scared them off." Mr. Thompson's eyes widened, and he looked down at Rusty, a smile spreading across his face. "Did he now?" He knelt down, scratching behind Rusty's ears. "Good boy, Rusty. You've still got it, don't you?" Rusty let out a soft woof, his tail wagging harder as he looked between Mrs. Harriet and Mr. Thompson. Despite his years, despite his injury, Rusty had proved he was still a protector, still the loyal dog that would do anything to keep his people safe. Mr. Thompson helped Mrs. Harriet to her feet, guiding her back toward her house. "Come on, Harriet. Let's get you inside, and then he'll call the police. They'll want to know what happened." Mrs. Harriet nodded, her hand resting on Rusty's head as they walked. "Thank you, Rusty," she said softly, her voice full of emotion. "You really are incredible." As they made their way inside, Rusty walked beside her, his steps slow but sure. He may have been older, he may have been partially disabled, but that night, Rusty had shown everyone that true strength wasn't about physical perfection, it was about heart, loyalty, and the willingness to stand up for those you love. And when the stars began to show up in the night sky above Maplewood Lane, the neighborhood seemed just a little bit safer because of one improbable dog named Rusty. The days following the attempted break-in were a whirl of activity along Maplewood Lane. News of Rusty's bravery spread like wildfire, and it wasn't long before people started stopping by to congratulate Mr. Thompson and Mrs. Harriet. Rusty, for his part, seemed to be enjoying all of the attention. Although generally calm, his tail would begin to wag furiously each time someone came by to pat his head or drop off a treat. Mr. Thompson was proud of his companion, and never stopped boasting about him. "That's right," he said to the crowd that had gathered in his yard one afternoon. "Rusty may be getting on in years, but he's still got the heart of a hero." Rusty sat beside him, his ears perked, his eyes watching Mr. Thompson with an expression of contentment. Mrs. Harriet was still in shock from what had happened. She was scared, but her fear was moderated by the gratitude she felt toward Rusty. She spent more time at Mr. Thompson's house, often sitting on the porch with Rusty by her side, a cup of tea in her hands. The once quiet and solitary evenings had turned into moments of shared companionship, with the two neighbors finding comfort in each other's presence. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard, Mrs. Harriet looked at Mr. Thompson, her eyes thoughtful. "You know, Thompson, I never thought I'd need saving," she said, her voice soft. "I've always been so independent. But that night, I realized just how fragile I am." She paused, her gaze drifting to Rusty, who lay at her feet. "I'm so grateful for Rusty. He reminded me that I was not alone." Mr. Thompson nodded, his face soft. "None of us are, Harriet. Rusty may have saved you that night, but it could have been anyone. We all look out for each other here. That's what being neighbors is all about." He reached down, scratching behind Rusty's ears. "Besides, Rusty's got a knack for knowing when he's needed. Don't you, boy?" Rusty let out a soft bark, his eyes closing in contentment as he leaned into Mr. Thompson's hand. Mrs. Harriet smiled, her heart swelling with affection for the old dog. There was something special about Rusty, something beyond his training or his years of service. It was his loyalty, his unwavering dedication to those he cared about, that made him truly remarkable. Well, not everyone shared in the euphoria about Rusty's heroics. Pete and Joey sat nursing their bruised egos, two men who had tried to break into Mrs. Harriet's house. They had never envisioned in a dream that an old dog was something that would foil their plan, and the humiliation caused by being chased off by Rusty had left a sour taste in their mouths. "I don't believe it," Pete growled, his face contorted in anger as he paced back and forth across their dingy apartment. Joey, sitting on the couch, rubbed the back of his neck, his expression uneasy. "I don't know, Pete. That dog. He wasn't like any other dog I've ever seen. He had this look, like he knew exactly what we were up to," Joey said with a mixture of wonder and fear in his voice. Pete sneered and waved a hand dismissively. "You're just being a coward. It was a dog, Joey. An old, crippled dog. We should have stood our ground. But now everyone in that neighborhood thinks they're safe. We need to show them that they aren't." Joey's eyes widened, and he shook his head. "You want to go back? Are you crazy? The cops are probably watching that place now. And that dog. Forget the dog." Pete snapped, his frustration boiling over. "We can't let them get away with this. We have to prove we're not scared." Joey hesitated. A growl from Rusty still echoed in his mind, and he was not as anxious as Pete to be returning to Maplewood Lane, but he knew better than to argue. Pete was adamant, and when he got like this, there was no changing his mind. A few nights later, under the cover of darkness, Pete and Joey found themselves back on Maplewood Lane. This time, they were more prepared, in dark clothing, their faces covered with masks, and carrying a bag of tools that Pete had insisted would help them finish the job. They moved quietly, their footsteps muffled by the grass as they approached Mrs. Harriet's house. "You sure about this?" Joey whispered, his eyes scanning around him nervously. The street was quiet, the houses dark, but he had an overwhelming feeling that they were being watched. Pete just ignored him, his gaze fixed on the house in front of them. "Just shut up and follow my lead," he hissed, eyes narrowing as they reached the side of the house. Producing a crowbar, he gestured for Joey to keep watch while he commenced prying open one of the windows. But as Pete worked, a familiar low growl echoed through the night. Joey's heart skipped a beat, his head snapping around to see Rusty standing at the edge of the yard, his eyes fixed on them, his teeth bared in a silent warning. "Pete," Joey whispered, his voice trembling. "It's the dog." Pete turned over his shoulder, screwing up his face in annoyance. "Are you kidding me? That blasted mud again?" Throwing down the crowbar, he pivoted toward Rusty. "Okay then, let's see it if you've still got it, old one." Rusty let out a louder bark this time, the sound carrying down the quiet street. Lights flickered on in the neighboring houses, and Pete's annoyance quickly turned to panic. He hadn't planned on drawing attention so soon. He glanced at Joey, who was already taking a step back, his eyes wide with fear. "We need to go, Pete," Joey urged, his voice shaking. "Now." But Pete wasn't ready to back down. He took a step closer to Rusty, his hands already clenched into fists. "I'm not running from some crippled dog," he growled. Rusty, however, was not going to let them get any closer. He lunged forward, and his bark echoed once more, with Pete stumbling backward, tripping over his own feet and landing hard on the ground. Joey, seeing his partner fall, did not hesitate. He turned and bolted, running down the street as fast as his legs could carry him. Pete scrambled to his feet, his face white as he turned to Rusty, who never budged, his eyes only for the intruder. Other lights now full on blazed from houses around them, and Pete caught voices, a shout, an open door here and there. Realizing they were out of time, Pete turned and ran, his heart pounding in his chest as he fled down the street after Joey. Rusty watched them go, his ears perked, his body tense until they disappeared into the darkness. Only then did he relax, his tail giving a slow wag as he turned and made his way back towards the house. By the time Mr. Thompson and Mrs. Harriet stepped outside, Rusty was already at the porch, his eyes bright, his demeanor calm, as if nothing unusual had happened. "Rusty!" Mr. Thompson called, pride dripping from his voice as he hurried over to the dog, kneeling down to pat his side. "Good boy, Rusty. You did it again, didn't you?" Mrs. Harriet knelt beside them, her eyes loaded with tears and hands slightly trembling. "Oh, Rusty," she whispered huskily, "you really are our hero." The neighbors had begun to gather, their faces reflecting a mixture of concern and admiration as they approached the porch. They had heard the barking, they had seen the intruders run, and now they looked at Rusty with a newfound respect. He wasn't just an old dog, he was their protector, the guardian of Maplewood Lane. Mr. Thompson looked up, his eyes meeting those of his neighbors. "Looks like Rusty scared them off again," he said, a note of pride in his voice. "I think it's safe to say that as long as Rusty's around, Maplewood Lane has nothing to fear." A murmur of agreement rose in the crowd as several came forward, either to pat Rusty on the head or express thanks. Rusty accepted such attention with his usual equanimity, his tail stirring in lazy arcs as he gazed from Mr. Thompson to Mrs. Harriet. Mrs. Harriet smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude as she looked at the old dog. "Thank you, Rusty," she whispered, almost inaudibly. "Thank you for everything." As the night slowly returned to peacefulness, so did the neighbors disperse. Each of them cast one last look at Rusty and went on to their various homes. The danger was over, but the sense of community had increased. They could count on one another, and Rusty, to protect them. And as the stars twinkled above, Rusty settled down on the porch, his eyes half closed, his body relaxed. He had done his job, and he would do it again if needed. Because to Rusty, it wasn't about being a hero. It was about protecting the people he loved, no matter the cost. And that was something that no amount of age or injury could ever take away. The next morning, Maplewood Lane was alive with an esprit de corps that none of them had seen in ages. News of Rusty's heroics had leaked out of the neighborhood to the local news stations, and soon the reporters began to arrive recognizing a good story of a heroic dog who saved an elderly neighbor once, let alone twice. The usually discreet Mrs. Harriet found herself facing a camera and recounted the events of the past nights rather nervously. "Oh, Rusty is just the most wonderful dog," she said, her voice shaking slightly as she spoke into the microphone. "He may be older, but he's got the heart of a lion. I don't know what would have happened if it wasn't for him." She looked down at Rusty, who sat obediently by her side, his tail wagging gently as if he understood every word. Mr. Thompson stood proudly nearby, nodding his head in agreement. "Rusty has always been a protector," he added. "Even after retiring from the police force, he never lost that sense of duty. We're all lucky to have him here." The news crew filmed Rusty as he sat next to Mrs. Harriet, his ears perked and eyes alert. They captured the quiet strength of the old dog, his scars and stiff leg telling the story of years of service and loyalty. The footage was broadcast that evening, and within days, Rusty turned out to be some sort of local celebrity. People from other towns were visiting to see the dog who fearlessly guarded his people. But with all this new attention came a deeper-seated tension that Mr. Thompson couldn't shake. He knew Pete and Joey might not be done with their attempts. The humiliation they'd suffered was enough to push them towards desperate measures, and Mr. Thompson couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that they might try something even more reckless. One evening, as Mr. Thompson sat on his porch, Rusty resting at his feet, Mrs. Harriet came over, her face etched with worry. "Thompson," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "do you think those men will come back again?" Mr. Thompson scowled, his eyes wandering to Rusty, who looked up at him as if knowing the worry that filled the air. "I don't know, Harriet," he confessed. "But if they do, well, be ready. Rusty won't let anything happen to you. And neither will I." Mrs. Harriet nodded, her eyes clouding. "I don't understand why people like that would think they can do anything," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "It makes you feel so helpless." Mr. Thompson leaned over, patting her hand gently. They think they can intimidate us, Harriet. They think they can make us afraid. But they're wrong. We have each other, and we have Rusty. And that's more than enough to keep us safe." On cue, Rusty gave a soft huff, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the yard, his ears twitching at every slight sound. He was ever watchful, always prepared. And Mr. Thompson found comfort in that, even if the uncertainty of what might come next loomed over them. Days passed uneventfully, and the neighborhood began to settle back into its usual routine. The excitement about Rusty's heroics ebbed, replaced by comfortable normalcy. Children were playing in the yards, neighbors nodded at each other as they went about their errands, and the quiet of Maplewood Lane was seemingly back. But this night, with the moon hanging low in the sky, unease flooded Rusty. Lifting his head from his paws, his ears perked and listened intently. Something was off. He could feel it. A tension hung in the air, a soft sound on the breeze that put his hackles up. Mr. Thompson had been dozing in his chair on the porch, and he noticed Rusty's sudden alertness. "What is it, boy?" he asked, his voice low as he followed Rusty's gaze towards the darkened street. Rusty straightened to a taut crouch and hunched his nose twitching as he scented the air. Without pausing or deviation, he went to the stairs, his limp almost missing on the way down to the yard. Mr. Thompson watched, his heart growing, before he rose, peering back into the shadows. And then he saw a figure moving between the houses, staying low, trying to remain unseen. Mr. Thompson's jaw clenched, and he quickly stepped inside to grab his flashlight. He wasn't about to let anyone threaten his home or his neighbors again. "Rusty, stay close," he yelled as he stepped back outside, the beam from his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The figure froze, caught in the beam, and for a second or two, Mr. Thompson felt his heart sink as he realized it was Pete. Pete's eyes widened, and he turned, trying to flee, but Rusty was already moving. With a deep, rumbling growl, the old dog lunged forward, his body low to the ground as he closed the distance between them. Pete stumbled, his feet tangling as he tried to escape, but Rusty was relentless, his bark echoing through the night. Lights turned on along the street, doors opening as neighbors stepped outside, their faces filled with confusion and fear. Mrs. Harriet, her heart pounding, hurried to her window, her eyes widening as she saw Rusty chasing the intruder across her yard. "Oh dear," she whispered, her hands shaking as she reached for the phone. She dialed the police, trying to speak firmly, but even her voice shook. "Please hurry," she added, her eyes stuck on the scene outside. As Pete realized he could not outrun Rusty, he turned to face him, his hands raised in defense. All right. Call him off," he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. But Rusty wasn't about to back down. He circled Pete, his growl deep and threatening, his eyes locked onto the man who had dared to return to Maplewood Lane. Mr. Thompson approached cautiously, the flashlight still trained on Pete, his expression cold. "You picked the wrong neighborhood," Mr. Thompson said steady, though his heart was racing with adrenaline. "Rusty, hold." On command, Rusty stopped, still tensed, his gaze never leaving Pete as the sound of sirens could be heard in the distance. Pete's shoulders slumped in defeat, his face pale, looking around to see the neighbors that had congregated, their eyes filled with anger and disdain. The police had hardly taken a moment when the situation became subdued. They soon cuffed Pete's wrists, and were dragging him along as he growled away to himself. Mr. Thompson watched his actions with a calm, slower beating heart, having leaned an arm on Rusty's back. Mrs. Harriet rushed over. "Thompson, are you all right? Is Rusty okay?" Mr. Thompson nodded, a tired smile crossing his face. "We're fine, Harriet. Rusty did his job, just like always." She knelt down, wrapping her arms around Rusty, her voice breaking as she whispered, "Thank you, Rusty. Thank you for protecting us again." Rusty leaned into her embrace, his tail in a soft wag as he licked her cheek. The neighbors, again, all gathered around, faces mixed with relief and admiration, knowing well that without Rusty, things could have turned out so differently. One of the officers came over to Mr. Thompson, his face solemn. "You and your dog did a good job tonight," he said. "But you need to be careful. These guys might not give up so easily." Mr. Thompson nodded, his eyes straying to Rusty. "I know, but so long as Rusty's here, I think we'll be all right." The officer smiled slightly and nodded before turning back toward his car. The neighbors began to disperse, their voices hushed as they returned to their homes, casting grateful glances at Rusty as they went. "Mrs. Harriet remained behind, her hand on Rusty's head as she looked at Mr. Thompson. "I don't know what we would do without him," she said softly, her eyes misting over. "He's more than just a dog, Thompson. He's our guardian." Mr. Thompson smiled, his heart swelling with pride as he looked at Rusty. "You're right, Harriet. He's our guardian. And as long as he's here, Maplewood Lane will always be safe." As the night finally settled into silence, Rusty lay down on the porch, his eyes half closed, his body relaxing once more. He had done his job, and he would do it again, no matter how many times it was needed. Because for Rusty, protecting the people he loved was more than just a duty, it was his purpose. And that purpose gave him strength, no matter his age or the scars he carried. And as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, Maplewood Lane stood quiet and safe, the residents resting peacefully, knowing that their guardian was watching over them.